Hi friends, Robin here from Cheese from Scratch, and you are here for the second video of this series of getting started baking cheese. In last week's video, I took you guys through what recipes I recommend for beginners and kind of how to just pick a recipe, why I recommend picking those recipes. And in today's video, I want to teach you how to source ingredients, what ingredients you need for cheese making, and ultimately the things that I kind of recommend and the things that I don't. So that's what today's video is all about. And then in next week's video, we're going to be looking at equipment that you need to get started and just kind of how to make do with stuff that you already have in your kitchen. So this series is all about getting started making cheese. It's about going back to the basics and really kind of getting rid of all the noise so that we're not overwhelming you, because I know that when you're learning the new skill of cheese making, it can sometimes feel overwhelming. You could come onto my channel and you could see all sorts of different things. I do have all sorts of things on my channel. I have tutorials, I have in-depth videos into all sorts of different things, like how to learn how to press cheese. I have information on milk cows. So there's a lot of information out there. And so I really wanted to just break it down into very simple layman's terms just to make it just easier to get going so that you can get started, because that's the best way to learn how to make cheese, is actually just to get started and not get overwhelmed before you start. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at the basic ingredients that you actually need to start making cheese. So I have all of the ingredients that you might need to use today here, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of the ingredients. Now, it is really cool because there are thousands of different cheeses in the world, and all of them are basically made from the same four ingredients of milk, culture, so bacterial culture, rennet, and salt. So all of the cheeses in the world are basically made from those ingredients. There's definitely some variation to those ingredients. A few of them have a few extra things, but that's the real basics of it. And so today's video, we're going to be talking about each of those things. We're going to start with milk. We're going to talk a little bit about bacterial cultures. We're going to look at rennet and anything else that you need with rennet. We're going to be looking at salt and how to choose salt for cheese making. So very basic ingredient video, because if you have started to learn how to make cheese, if you've started to look up some recipes, you might be starting to get a little bit confused about the things that you need. So to start us off, we're going to be talking about milk. So I have some milk here. It says that it's grocery store milk, but it's actually from my milk cows. You can see it's got a nice cream line on it. So this is a couple-day-old milk from my milk cows that we milked out. Now, you can make cheese whether you have a milk cow or whether you don't. And so if you don't have a milk cow, the options available to you are probably either pasteurized milk, or raw milk from like a herd share, or maybe if you live in an area where you can actually buy raw milk from the grocery store. Now, almost all milk can be used to make cheese. There is one exception. You cannot use ultra pasteurized milk. So if you live in the United States, particularly because in Canada, we don't have much ultra pasteurized milk. We do have some, but not as much as in the United States. I know that ultra pasteurized milk almost makes up the majority of the milk that you can buy in the grocery store. So ultra pasteurized milk will not turn to cheese. It has gone through too much processing and it will not coagulate. So that is a big no-no when you're first learning how to make cheese, is you can choose pasteurized milk, but make sure that it doesn't say ultra pasteurized on that bottle. Oftentimes, if you look in the organic section, if you look in the local milk section, if you source milk from a farm, even if they've pasteurized it, it's probably not going to be ultra pasteurized. So those are some sources to look for if you're having trouble finding that just regular pasteurized milk. It won't say ultra pasteurized on there. It'll just say regular pasteurized or low temp pasteurized. So you can use that milk for cheese making. Raw milk you can also use for cheese making. So my recommendation for choosing all milk for cheese making is making sure that you're choosing fresh milk. The fresher the milk, the better. Now, my preference for making cheese, because I do have my own milk cows, is actually milk that's still warm from the udder. It hasn't had a chance to cool down. It hasn't had a chance to cream line. So you can see that cream line there. So that warm, fresh milk from the udder that's just been brought in from the barn, it's been strained and it's put in the cheese pot. That's going to make me the very, very best cheese. But I know that's a little bit of a luxury because most of us don't have access to that. We have to use milk that has been refrigerated. And refrigeration is kind of an unnatural process for milk. Milk was never meant to be refrigerated, and in fact, refrigeration is very new in the history of milk. And so we're going to be able to make better cheese if we are using the freshest milk possible. The longer milk sits in the refrigerator, the more it's going to degrade, the harder it's going to be to turn that milk into cheese. And oftentimes I'm kind of asked by people that have older milk in their fridge, they're like, hey, what kind of cheese can I make out of this old milk? Because it's, like starting to curdle in the back of my fridge. And kind of my answer to that is not a very good one. So you could make a cheese that is maybe fresh out of that if it's still safe to consume that milk, which is maybe it's not, I'm not sure. I can't tell you that over the internet, but it's not going to make a good aged cheese. 100% do not use that old milk for making an aged cheese because that's going to be gross. Secondly, it probably won't taste that good. So fresh milk is my priority when I make cheese. The fresher, the better. So if I'm using raw milk, I try not to use milk that's older than 2 or 3 days. If it's been stored properly in the refrigerator has its place, it's good. But no older than 2 or 3 days because raw milk is a living ecosystem. Within this raw milk, there's all sorts of different bacterias and funguses. And just because I take this milk and I put it in the refrigerator, it doesn't mean that this milk actually stops living. Those bacterias and yeasts and little microorganisms are still feeding and multiplying. And the problem is that they like to feed on the same food that our cheese-making starter culture likes to feed on, which is lactose. And so that milk is going to become more acidic. There's going to be less food for our actual needed starter culture bacteria. And it's just not going to make as good cheese. It's going to be harder. It's going to be more of a wild card. So if you can start out with milk that is fresh, it's sort of like being a painter and starting out with a fresh canvas. You can really make that milk into whatever you want to make it into, and it's going to act the way that you expect it to act. The older it is, the more variables there are. The more it's going to be a little bit more difficult to turn the milk into cheese. So I think I have beat that horse dead. Use fresh milk for cheese making. That is priority. Don't use ultra pasteurized milk, but you can use raw milk. You can use pasteurized milk, but warm from the udder is kind of my preference. So that's choosing milk for cheese making. Now, the second ingredient I want to talk about is bacterial culture. So when you make cheese, almost all cheeses need to have a starter culture added into them. And for sure, 100% any cheese that's going to be aged needs to have a starter culture added into it. And so if you've done any sort of fermentation, whether you've fermented vegetables or whether you've made sourdough, made kombucha, you kind of probably understand a little bit about fermentation, where we add a bacteria into our milk, and we are going to allow that bacteria to feed and ferment, and it's going to start all sorts of different fermentation cycles in our milk. So it can be really complex, but at the end of the day, you don't have to know a ton about it for it to actually work. So when we are dealing with cheese making, we use something called a starter culture. So starter cultures can be purchased online at any cheese supply store, or they can be made at home. In the case of my clabberculture, if you've heard me talk about clabberculture, this is it. So a couple different ways that you can source bacterial culture. So starter culture, they reside under this big head category of bacteria known as lactic bacteria. So what lactic bacteria are there bacteria that like to feed on sugar. And so lactose is actually the sugar in the milk. So lactobacteria, they come into milk and they start to feed on that sugar. And as they feed on it, they ferment it into lactic acid, which thus acidifies the milk. And at a certain stage, when the milk becomes acidic enough, the milk is actually going to coagulate. So this is how you make yogurt. For example, in the last video, I talked about how it's really a good idea to start making cheese with just a simple dairy product like yogurt or klabber or kefir, because that's going to get you started. That's going to get you started culturing dairy products and kind of understanding that importance of fermentation. So when you choose a starter culture, usually recipes are going to ask for something called a mesophilic culture or a thermophilic culture. Now, are a bunch of different lactic bacteria that can be used in cheese making, but almost all of them, or actually all of them, can be classified under these two umbrella terms of mesophilic being a lower temperature culture and thermophilic, that thermo, being a higher temperature loving culture. So these cultures, they like to ferment in these different temperature ranges. So most recipes are going to either ask for a mesophilic or a thermophilic culture. So when you go onto the cheese supply store, for example, I've got a thermophilic here. What you're going to do is you're going to look at these starter cultures for cheeses. So usually in the top bar of most cheese supply websites, it's going to say starter cultures. You're going to click on that. And you're going to look and you're going to see a ton of different starter cultures. But something that you're going to see in common with all of these starter cultures is they're all either listed under thermophilic or mesophilic. So I like to click on, say, a mesophilic one, and underneath that culture, it's going to tell you the cheeses that are good with that culture. So for example, it might say it's good for cheddars and Colbys. So I would pick that culture. So when I go onto the cheese supply website, I try not to get overwhelmed because it is really easy to get overwhelmed. I'm going to pick one mesophilic culture and one thermophilic culture that are going to work for most of the cheeses I'm planning on making. And in last week's video, I kind of talked about how pick one cheese and make that cheese often. So I would pick whichever culture would work good for that cheese. And then I would also use it for other mesophilic cheeses, even if it wasn't kind of listed under there. So for example, if it said it was good for cheddars and Colbys, I would also use that for a Gouda because Gouda uses a mesophilic culture. So just keeping a couple cultures in your freezer and then kind of working with that. And you can expand and learn as you go, but that's just going to kind of get you started. Now, I also talked about in last week's video about my clabber culture. So I actually don't use freeze-dried cultures anymore. I started by using them. They helped me make some really good cheeses. They helped me not feel really overwhelmed when I was first learning how to make cheese because it is a little bit overwhelming when you're first learning. But since then, I have learned how to keep a clabber culture. And I'm going to link a video down below so you can go and check that out. I mentioned in last week's video that it's a great place to start if you have access to raw milk. It's a great dairy product to start to learn how to make. So I'll link that all down below, but you guys can go and check that out. So the cool thing about clabber is that it can be used as a starter culture for all sorts of different cheeses. For example, I use this for making cheddar. I use it for making Parmesan. I use it for making Colby, brie. I use it for all sorts of different cheeses that I'm going to make. And because it's a raw milk bacteria, or a raw milk starter culture, it has a bunch of different bacterias in this clabber. And these bacterias can be used to make either mesophilic cheeses or thermophilic cheeses. Now, to really further confuse you, and don't get further confused, but some people choose to ferment their clabber culture at a warmer temperature to get more thermophilic bacteria, and the lower temperature to get more mesophilic bacteria. So if you're kind of coming to this video and you already have a sense of how to do that and how to keep a clabber culture, you might want to consider that. But honestly, I ferment my clabber culture at the same temperature all the time, and I use it for all the different cheeses that I make. So really, really versatile, and it's a cool dairy product to make. So check out that video below, but that is that clabber culture. Now, the next ingredient I want to talk about is something called rennet. So rennet is an enzyme and it's used in cheese making to cause quick coagulation. So when we added clabber culture in, or this thermophilic culture in, the bacteria have to feed and they have to ferment that lactose into lactic acid. It's a very slow process. And once that milk becomes acidic enough, that milk coagulates. Now, rennet, when it comes into milk, it causes very quick coagulation. Coagulation is going to occur about 30 minutes to an hour after you add rennet into milk. And why this is really cool in cheese making is because as cheesemakers, we're really kind of trying to drive milk in the direction that we want to turn this milk into all sorts of different cheeses. As I said, there are thousands of different cheeses in the world, and they're all made from these basic four ingredients of milk, bacterial culture, rennet, and salt. But it's kind of us as a cheesemaker that takes the wheel and kind of drives it in the direction that we want to help it turn into different products. So part of driving this bus, part of driving the cheese making, is being able to manipulate that milk early on in the cheese making journey before full fermentation has happened. So we put our milk in the pot. We bring it up to a temperature that's going to be good for fermentation. We add in our starter culture. And instead of having to wait 12, 24 hours until this fermentation causes coagulation, we add some rennet into that pot, and this causes quick coagulation so that now we can cut that curd into smaller pieces. We can release some of the moisture from those curds. We can stir them. We can heat them to different temperatures. It just makes milk more manageable for us, more easier to use. And so that's one of the reasons that we use rennet in cheese making, and it's a really necessary ingredient in a lot of different cheeses. Some fresh cheeses you're not going to use it for, even some lactic aged cheeses we're not going to use it for, but pretty much every cheese that you come across is going to ask for rennet as an ingredient. Now, I have a full video on how to source rennet, some differences between different rennets. So if you want to check that out, I will link that down below as well. It is kind of complex, but honestly, at the end of the day, all you can do is go onto the cheese supply store, pick out a rennet and order it. I like to use pure calf rennet, but you can use whatever rennet that you want. Just don't use junket rennet. Junket rennet doesn't work that good. Now, at the beginning of this video, I talked about how you can make milk or make cheese with raw milk, or you can make cheese with pasteurized milk. As long as it hasn't been ultra pasteurized, you can still make cheese. Now, during the pasteurization process of milk, what actually happens is that not only do the bacteria get killed off, the good bacteria and the bad bacteria, but the structure of the milk actually changes a little bit, and the composition of the milk actually changes a little bit. And one of the things that actually changes in that milk is the calcium content. So in pasteurized milk cheeses, you always need to add calcium chloride into that milk to kind of bring it back to its original composition. And calcium plays a big role in getting rennet to coagulate. Rennet cannot coagulate milk if it does not have calcium in the milk. I like to think of the calcium sort of as the glue that helps the proteins in the milk stick together, and they will not stick if you don't add that in with that pasteurized milk. Now, raw milk has enough calcium in it. It has enough of that glue already in it that you can add rennet in, and it's going to coagulate. It's not going to have a weak curd. But if it's been pasteurized, you always need to make sure that you're adding that calcium chloride in. It's very cheap. It keeps forever. You can buy it on the cheese supply website. Just keep it in your fridge. So if you're making pasteurized milk cheeses, or even if you aren't, I still like to keep some in my fridge. I'm not going to overwhelm you today, but there are some other instances where if you're not being able to get a good curd, sometimes you add a little bit of this in. If you're making goat's milk cheese, often goat's milk cheese makers will add a little calcium chloride just to get a firmer curd, but I won't overwhelm you with that. So good idea to have some calcium chloride in the fridge, especially if you are going to be using pasteurized milk to make cheese. And then finally, our final ingredient is salt. So salt is very easy to source for cheese making. You can buy it at the regular grocery store. There are some rules. You want to make sure that on the ingredient label of that salt, it says nothing but salt. So you don't want to have any iodine in there, no anti-clumping agents. Those things are going to actually interact with your fermentation, and they could cause your milk to not ferment as well. Now, salt acts as the referee in cheese making. It comes into cheeses and it slows down fermentation, and it helps kind of set your cheese up for aging, where a whole bunch of other levels of fermentation, it gets too confusing. I won't even explain it. You don't even have to know it. You can age cheese without knowing any of that stuff. But anyway, salt is the referee. It comes in, it slows everything down, and it helps prepare your cheese for aging. So it's really important that you're adding salt into your cheeses when and how the recipes ask for it. I like to use fine ground salt. Most recipes, that's what they're going to ask for. I just buy it at the regular grocery store, and I just pick one that just said salt on that ingredient list, nothing else. So that's probably the easiest ingredient that you're going to be able to source. Now, thank you guys for watching this video. As I said, this is part 2 of my Getting Started Making Cheese series. So in part 3, we're going to be looking at some simple equipment that you need to make cheese, and then you can go on and make all sorts of different cheeses. So thank you guys for watching this video. If you haven't already, click subscribe down below. And I forgot to plug in my last video, but pre-sales for my cheese making book are going to be starting on December 31st. So I wrote a real hold in your hands cheese making book through a publisher, Homestead Living, who has published books by Lisa Bass from Farmhouse on Boone, Carolyn Thompson from Homesteading Family. So I'm really, really honored to have wrote this book. It's going to be coming out in spring 2025. But if you want to be notified when those pre-sales start, make sure that you sign up to my newsletter below, and I will make sure that I send you guys that when pre-sales open. But anyways, I'll see you guys next Monday for part 3 of this Getting Started Making Cheese series. Okay, bye guys.